Okay, step four. We're getting toward the end. Writing the discussion section. Um, so this is another section that I think can be difficult to write, and I'll tell you the part I find difficult. So um, there's one part where you talk about kind of limitations and future research. That part's usually easy for me. Usually just based on the design, there are some fairly predictable limitations of your study. So, for example, if you used self reports, you can talk about measurement issues. If you had a convenience sample, it's easy to kind of talk about what could have been better there. You can talk about potential limits of the, if you used an experimental design, you made some particular decisions that may have weaknesses and other methods could help address. So this section I feel like is fairly easy. I'm an ideas person, so I like planning and thinking about what could be done. So this section's fairly easy for me. There are some applied journals that will want you to have a section about kind of practical implications, and usually this is pretty speculative. So you kind of have to qualify a lot of what you're saying, but it's like, okay, if we're right about this, how does it matter, particularly for clinicians? And so, those sections are fairly straightforward, although you have to do some thinking. But the part that I think can be hard is um, the first section of the discussion. What you're supposed to be doing is relating your findings to prior theory and research, and kind of, what's the main take home point? Why do your findings matter? And what's tempting, I usually have to rewrite mine after I do it wrong. But basically, it's tempting to just kind of restate a lot of what you said in the results section, but you have to push it forward beyond that. And um, yeah, so I mean, Josh gives some general suggestions of how to do that. Once again, I think the easiest way to kind of get a sense of this is by looking at some examples. So Josh has an example, and I'll go over that, and then I'll kind of show you an example from one of the papers I did. So I think he's working from the same example. So he restates the main goal of the study, and then he has a paragraph that um, restates the primary findings, and then um, he kind of elaborates on some of the more important findings and kind of implications. Um, so his example, what he's trying to do is just give you a sense of the purpose of each paragraph. So um, one thing I have found is if it's really hard to write these first several paragraphs of your discussion, it might be a sign that the paper's not very good. Um, so if you don't have a fairly good story about why it's important and kind of implications, then it could be that you need to kind of go back and look at the analysis, or just think of a different way of kind of spinning what you're doing. So, um, when I'm reviewing a paper, if I get to the end and the discussion section is particularly flat, it's usually a bad sign. So, even though um, I can definitely relate to kind of feeling tired at the end and really not wanting to work on this section a lot, but I think it does end up being really important. So yeah, let me show you an example. So we recently did a paper where we kind of looked at John Haidt's moral foundation theory, and even though the discussion isn't particularly long, Um, it this paper was actually fairly short. Um, it had plenty of zing to it because the ideas we were testing were pretty interesting. So we generally kind of reminded the reader of kind of the influence of moral foundations theory, and then kind of restated our intent to kind of hone in and see whether that theory, and particularly one of the main hypotheses, generalized within black samples. And then our main restatement of findings was that we had problems both with the hypothesis and we saw measurement invariance problems. And then we kind of elaborate on what it might mean, some of the particularly measurement issues that we saw, and also some of the implications of that for the theory. And then, to be honest, I mean that this might be a little bit skimp, but we have kind of more elaborate discussion of what like kind of next steps might be. So in addition to just kind of acknowledging some of the limits of our sample, we kind of pivot into discussing kind of some practical ways to bolster the theory and the measurement of moral foundations theory. And there's a little bit of speculation at the end. You know, after we've done all this work, we kind of draw on a major review and kind of make the suggestion to make sure to sample some of the domains in ways that, you know, for example, they've got a sacred domain that we're not completely convinced that that liberals don't have, that they wouldn't necessarily endorse kind of values related to purity and sanctity. And so we kind of give some suggestions in terms of scale development there. So, if there is a place where you can be a little more speculative, it's usually toward the end of your discussion where you're talking about future research.